whether it's through body, through muscle, or just sheer size. You could be obese, for instance, right? To increase your size to make yourself look bigger, okay, right? So there's the ego serving the self and others. When you're learning a certain type of knowledge and you become indoctrinated by that knowledge, now that knowledge confines you, right? And because it confines you, now you become ignorant to everything else because everything else is stupid. The story goes that, when they saw someone with some swag, they're like, he's got Jeet Kune Do, she's got Jeet Kune Do, and things like that. So they use Jeet Kune Do as a way to reference excellence or brilliance or beauty or glamour or whatever it was.
Welcome to another Martial Mind Power podcast. I'm Jatinder with co-host Sifu Lak. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Sifu.
Welcome, everyone. How you doing, JT?
Yeah, good and well. We say good and well, but we know that really and realistically that we do go through troubles and issues. It's not always a good thing, So, but on the podcast, we want to be very enthusiastic and just share a message of, mindfulness, peacefulness, and things like that. But yeah, okay.
I like to say all is well.
All is well, yeah.
The reason I say all is well is because everything's happening in divine perfection.
Yeah.
So it can only be well.
That's it.
Right.
I sometimes say 50-50 and people look at me like, what? And I say, positive and negative, so it's balanced.
Exactly.
Awesome. So welcome everyone. And we're going to be taking you again to another koan in the book, The Art of Thinking Without Thinking. And we're going to do something slightly different today. I've gone to the almighty Google and typed in random number generator. Yeah, between 6 and 744, I think, is the number of pages to see what random number we come up with, which we'll then go to in the book with, yeah? So I'm just going to press that. And the number that's come up is 490. So let's see what's on page 490. It'd be funny if we've already done this one, but let's see. 490. You got it? Right? What we got?
Oh, brilliant. Fantastic.
Okay.
The topic of the day
is getting rid of your ego. So that's page 490 is where that koan is on.
490. All right. So let me show the viewers the artwork for this. Okay. So it's a picture of somebody with a mask. Okay, and the person is got his hand held up, palm up to the sky, with what looks like a flower in it. Okay, but ultimately there's a white mask. Okay, and the koan, the biggest ego trip going, is getting rid of your ego. Okay, now, okay, so Mr. JT Jedi, okay, what you make of that?
What comes up for me on that one is, I get through brain association. What does the word ego to me mean? To me, the word ego is identity, is whatever through life experiences we've come about and we've created this identity of who we think we are. And I call that the ego. So whatever falls in that or without that, outside of that, is where our comfort zones lie. And, to think that we are ego is, this is where the koan is taking me, to think that we're not really fixed in identity as such, because as we learn more, we become more, so that's what's come up for me.
Good. All right. So here's a question, right? So with ego, right? Identity, right? So what is identity?
Mm-hmm.
What really is identity? What does identity mean to you?
So to me, identity is like it's a collection of experiences, knowledge, information that we've put together to create some sort of form of what we think we're all about. So, I don't know, you're a bodybuilder. yeah, everything that goes around it, the diet you have to have, the amount of times you have to go to the gym and pump iron, as they say, the food you eat, the people you interact with, the way you sleep, I don't know, all of that becomes part of your identity and ego. And if somebody then comes along and says, I don't know, they say, I'm a vegan bodybuilder, then a non-vegan bodybuilder might think, that's what are you talking about? And vice versa. And there's a clash of egos or personalities in my way is the way, your ways may not be the way, that kind of thing. So it's like a collection of stuff we've gathered through our years of who we think we are right now.
So who does this ego serve then?
Ourselves.
And?
What was that last bit? Sorry?
All right. So I said, who does it serve? You said yourself.
Yeah.
And I said, and
I suppose others, in the way that you show up on what you can influence how people or what they think of you as well, in the way you present that ego presents itself.
Exactly. It's perception, right? It's a perception of, it's a perception that you want to give, not only to others, but also a perception of the self. Now, let me give an example, right? As a hypnotherapist and an NLP coach, okay, doing healings with people. One of the things that I've discovered through studies and through some of the healings that I've done is people that tend to, this is not everyone, but just some of the specific cases that I worked on, right, and some of the specific cases that I've read about, people that try and to make their exterior large, in particular strong, generally are trying to create an external perception or facade through their bodily structure to create almost like a defense mechanism, right, to protect this inner child that was traumatized, bullied, and harassed in their childhood. Okay, right. So when somebody like, it could be a bodybuilder, could be a martial artist, could be, somebody in, let's just say, one of these combative or strength type of perceptions that you're trying to create, where you're trying to make yourself larger and stronger than your inner self is, right? That outward perception is the ego expression to others, okay? Because you want others to think that you're strong, you're big, and this could also be big for people that overeat, all right, and big in size, okay? Because in the end, size can also be deemed as strength, okay? Right? But on the inside, the perception to the self is actually, there is protection with that, okay? So there's an inner ego that's going on as well. And that inner ego is saying, actually, there is some trauma inside that I'm trying to deal with by creating some external fabrication, right? Whether it's through body, through muscle, or just sheer size by, you could be obese, for instance, right? To increase your size to make yourself look bigger, okay? Right? So there's the ego serving the self and others.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you're sharing that. I mean, someone comes to mind. I'm not going to say who it is. It's someone I know where that exactly what you said is what's going on. This person, from a young age, has been quite quiet, but now is quite big, not necessarily in a good way, and it comes across sometimes that bigness is just to be larger than life, to say, I am something, I stick out, this is where I am. Because when you see them in different states, you see different behavior, and linking up the different behavior. Having studied the human behavior as well, you kind of see these patterns. So I can relate to what you're saying. And it's obviously it's not always the case. I mean, sometimes people have issues, health issues and whatnot. So we're not talking about anything like that in any way.
Exactly.
with, it's individual. So you got to take into context everything else. But it can happen where these things, influence the way you are comes from childhood trauma, possibly, or just the way you've interacted with the world over time. So yeah, it does. You can spot that in people as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So here's the thing, right? So the ego is serving a purpose, right? And that purpose is to protect oneself. Okay, right? So it's a defense mechanism. Okay, it's a defense mechanism. It's trying to, in the cases that I've described, right? And these are the cases where I've actually had first-hand experience with either as an accomplice, an associate, a friend of someone in that position, healing someone in that position, or material that I've read on cases, hypnotherapy cases and NLP cases and healing cases around that specific scenario, because I'm exposed to the martial arts and fitness industry. I see it all the time. Okay. I see it all the time. All right. And I can tell who's suffering from what, why, when. All right. Straight away. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do that. I've been doing this a bloody long time, right? So as a consequence, right, you start to, as you said, start to pick up the patterns. So that's why I use that as an example, right? So the ego is actually trying to protect the individual, right? But the ego isn't the individual. Now, let me go on to explain, right? Now, let's carry on with this example of a child that's traumatized, bullied at school or whatever it might be, and then later on goes in life to become a bodybuilder, right? Really big, butch, and strong, right? Now, what happens if you heal that inner child that was traumatized? Now, is there any need for having an over-muscularized body? Is there really any need? Right?
That's a very, very interesting question. I mean, you shared it on that martial arts or bodybuilding side of things, but I've had firsthand experience where coaches have shared that as well with people who they've coached in life, are doing something for a particular reason. They don't necessarily know why, but when they dig deeper to say, is this what you really want? And they go back and figure out where that initial thought came from, which most of the time is from some sort of trauma or some situation or scenario. When they've realized that that's what's going on, then the thing they set out to do changes. They're like, oh, I don't actually really need to do that. What I really want to do is this, And in some cases, what's happened is that thing that was seen as a weakness or some challenge has then gone on to become their biggest achievement and challenge and help for others as well. So it's a really interesting thing.
Absolutely. And that as a hypnotherapist, as an NLP coach, as a healer, right? The number one rule is the presenting problem is never the problem, right? You always got to start off with that. So whatever symptoms, ailments, conditions, right, unresourceful conditions that a person is exhibiting, that isn't the problem. The problem is always something way deeper underneath, right? And could be something that didn't happen recently, but it's happened a long time ago, okay? Not always, but in general, okay? And as a consequence, you got to unpack that. You got to dig deep and find out how to get there. And the unconscious mind lets you do that, which is why hypnotherapy is amazing, right? But, it's not everyone's cup of tea. So, this podcast isn't here to push certain healing modalities onto people. Is to talk about things that work through our own experience. And really, we'll only talk about things that we're experienced and are qualified to talk about.
So the interesting thing about that is what you're sharing there, Lex, is that, with this podcast, we're just having conversation and sharing. But what we've also seen is that moment the person realizes or gets the awareness or insight as to, oh, this is just thoughts that I've created. This is something that's linked to something, and this isn't really necessarily who I am because that happened maybe years ago, or it hasn't really happened. You're creating it. They get insights into thinking, oh, I can actually think different and do different, That's a very good quote from Apple as well. They used to say, think different, right? So
no, absolutely. And, thinking is what makes it so, right? But, the coming back to this, right, point for a moment, right? Presenting problems, never the problem, right? the idea is when you are doing a healing and you heal the root cause of the problem, there's this concept of called collapsing the chain. Okay, so you have the root cause of the problem, and then you have a coping strategy, and that will serve you for a certain time until it becomes a problem, and then you have another coping strategy to cope with the symptoms of that which no longer serves you. So now you've got that will serve you for a short time until that becomes a problem, and then you'll create a coping strategy to deal with the problem of that, and you'll have another coping strategy, another behavior, whatever it might be, right? And all of a sudden, it can go on and on. But if you deal with the root cause, the whole chain goes collapses, right? So it's called collapsing the chain. Okay, you've got to get down to the root cause of the problem. Now let's just say, right, you've got a whole egocentric coping strategy, right? So you don't realize that you get caught up in the egocentricity of it all, but you go and you develop strategies, might be say go bodybuild, and all of a sudden, right, you've got the problems that come with bodybuild, and it kind of builds up, and the chain starts to grow. Let's just say now you collapse the root cause of the problem, which is this traumatized little child at school, and you manage to heal that, then all of that goes away, right? All of a sudden now, all the things that you associate with yourself are no longer relevant, right? Technically, they're no longer relevant. You might still choose to carry on being a bodybuilder, right? But they're no longer relevant. So now they don't serve the purpose for which you originally started out that mission, okay? So your ego means fuck all. Mm-hmm. That's what it means, yeah? You created all of these things and these identities to help yourself deal with something because you couldn't cope with it at that time, right? So you would never have to deal with it again. Mm-hmm. But then when you realize actually you always were whole, healed, and happy, and you had everything you needed, and those lessons were only then, right? But you're carrying them into your adulthood, and now those problems don't persist, so you don't need them anymore. All of a sudden, that ego that you are feeding means nothing.
Mm-hmm. Okay? Yeah. And the funny thing about ego as well is that I could be wrong, but in an experience of most times when somebody has spoken of ego, it tends to be looked at as a negative thing. Oh, the person's so egotistical, they're in their ego, they're full of ego and all this kind of thing. But I think that sometimes gets confused with the word pride. When people are very they have a lot of pride around who they are and they don't want to change that. Again, forms underneath the ego as a sort of identity element, right? But the ego, if you look at it, is like an identity. It's both positive and negative. Now your perception of the word ego would also be changed as well, because we might say ego and you might be getting charged up or getting a feeling around it, thinking, oh, or they might be thinking, yeah, it's good. But that in itself is like, okay, well, how do you think about ego and why do you think about ego that way?
And let me give you a beautiful example, right, of how, just talking about the ego and how you can use ego in a positive way. Now, ego usually is referred to in a negative way, but we've actually already been talking about ego actually as a positive thing because it's there to protect you, okay? It's there to protect you, it's there to protect a vulnerable inner child, right? A vulnerable little child, right? And you develop that strategy. When I get bigger, I'm going to be big and strong and so on. Bang, all of a sudden you're a bodybuilder, right? I mean, it takes a lot of years of work and good diet, nutrition, exercise.
We don't mean to pick on the bodybuilders either.
Yeah, but and we're not picking on bodybuilders. But the only reason we're using this as an example because it's an example that I've got experience in. Remember, but here's the thing, right? The Dalai Lama, right? He's, a beautiful being, right? And if anyone is wise to not being egoless, is also the Dalai Lama. But the Dalai Lama is playful with his position and his perception as being the Dalai Lama. So he's playful with it. Okay, he uses it in a fun way. Okay, he's not attached to it, but he uses it in a fun way, which is free and playful. Okay, so when you realize you may have a perception, or you may have an ego, as in an identity about your being or your role in life, the way you serve others. You can also be playful with it, although as long as you don't get caught up in it. All right. Mm-hmm. And the Dalai Lama is a beautiful example of where he is very playful at times, right? And he's using what I call ego playfulness, right? To use his position as a wise Dalai Lama to teach and guide people through humor and laughter. Because it's a beautiful, fun, instant vacation, instant way to do it, right? So ultimately, when you become free of the ego, you can then use the ego and play with it in a fun and light way without being attached to it. And that really is the ultimate expression of using ego to in a positive way to serve. Okay. And then there's that whole conversation around pride versus ego, right? I mean, pride, the word pride, it can be used in so many different ways, but a lot of it is to do with the same thing. Is to do with pride is usually, again, associated with an identity. You know, you're proud to be a father. Well, if you've got children, you know, you're a father or a mother. You know, if you're you know, you get a qualification, you're proud you got the qualification, and you want to celebrate all your hard work. Okay, so you're proud of that. But if you get too proud, where, you know, I'm clever than everyone else because I've got a qualification in something and you don't, right? That's not a good thing. Okay, that's not a good thing, because now you're using it to denigrate other people, right? Now you become attached to that thing. Okay, whereas I could say I'm proud to have gone through the hardships and the suffering, and then gone through the learnings and lessons and the trainings and the teachings, qualifications in order to serve others. And now I'm proud to be a healer. I'm proud to be a teacher, right? To help people. But it's just a way of expressing and celebrating that journey, right? Rather than being attached to it in such a way that it, you know, you're better than other people. And there's lots of different examples that we could use where, you know, pride and ego can be used in a negative way. But I think ultimately, ego identity is the kind of foundations of pride, right? If you're not careful. But if you use pride playfully, you can use it to say, well, you know, I have credibility in this space because I've got qualifications and experience in that space, so I can help you, right? So you can use your subject matter expertise and experience in order to serve someone in a higher way rather than put someone down. So there's, you know, again, that whole mechanism comes into play. But what
I just typed in Google, just wanted to see what Mr. Google thinks what ego is. And it says the self, especially as constructed with another self or the world.
Yeah, well, this is it. Self and others, right? So, you know, Google's well informed. By the way, how do you know it's Mr. Google?
It could be Mrs. Google. That's true as well. That's true. That is so true. To Mrs. Google. Could be anything these days, right?
Exactly.
AI Google.
So actually, funny you said that. That could be anything, right? Because my next thing was going to be, right, can you have multiple egos?
Definitely. It's just we got to ask Google, innit? How do you want to be associated?
Right. In other words, can you have multiple identities? Right. So, you know, the answer to that is yes, of course. I mean, look, I'll give you an example. Right. I think we all know somebody that acts different in different crowds. Okay. So they might have a school crowd, they act differently. They might have a home crowd, they act differently. They might have a relationship crowd, an uncles or aunts crowd, they act differently, and so on. Right. So they adapt to the different kind of social circles that they're in and are part of their lives and behave differently. Okay. That behavior is a projection of a different way of being because they want those social circles and the people within that to think of them in a certain way. All right. So you know that if you, and a lot of people do it anyway, right? So you've got a home identity, a personal identity, and a work identity. So when you go to work, you don't behave like you work out when you do at home, for instance, because if you did that, a lot of people will get sacked.
Exactly.
Right. But and again, I'm playfully joking with this as well, but there is some truth to that, right? Because there's certain things you can't do at work which you can't do at home, right? Okay.
Like, so Mrs. Google, she said the definitions of ego, right, are an inflated feeling of pride in your superiority to others. So that's like the other side of it now, isn't it?
So Mrs. Google said that and Mr. Google said the other. So basically, they both said the things that we've been talking about. So
exactly.
Yeah. What does that make us then? Mr. and Mrs. Google. The child, the Google child.
Google child.
The bastard Google child.
you know, like we always joke around like the Google, innit? We say in Punjabi when we're messing around at home, we say that Google is the Bhagwan of Kaljug. It's the god of the dark ages.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I was reading the Upanishads, right? And one of the Upanishads says, knowledge is ignorance, right? And I read that and I thought, wow, right? I'd like to understand what this means. So knowledge is ignorance. Now, most people would think actually knowledge is the way to get out of ignorance because you're learning something, right? But actually what it's referring to, this Upanishad, right, is that when you're learning a certain type of knowledge and you become indoctrinated by that knowledge, now that knowledge confines you, right? And because it confines you, now you become ignorant to everything else because everything else is stupid because you don't know what they know.
That's so egotistical, man.
Yeah, exactly. How dare you? So yeah, knowledge is ignorance, right? It's in the Upanishads. The Upanishads are the ancient teachings from India that were originally written in Sanskrit. Okay, so beautiful, powerful teaching. So if you are a little bit kind of like knowledge proud, just become aware of it so that you can kind of like ease up on that, because the perception around that is not a nice one for it, and we all know a know-it-all. Everybody's met a know-it-all in some way, shape, or form, and no one likes a know-it-all, and we all know that.
Yeah.
right. So don't be that person, basically, right?
And the funny thing is, the more we think we know, we realize we don't know anything, man.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
that's that as well, isn't it?
And then there's the flip side of it is that, and I find this in my corporate working life quite a lot is, there's everyone expects you to know everything about what's going on in the project, right? And I do find myself saying once in a while, you don't know what you don't know, right? Until you know it. And it takes a certain type of vulnerability and courage, because both exist at the same time, right? To be able to say that. In other words, you don't have to say, I don't know. It's another way of saying that. It's a really empowered way of saying you don't know what you don't know because no one's told you, right? And how do you expect to learn that? What, through fucking osmosis, right? There's no such thing, right? So it's just something to be aware of that, yeah, you're not going to know it all. And there's a really powerful quote that I learned years ago. and it's probably more prevalent now than it was when I first heard this quote. And and it goes like this: I've forgotten more than I know today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's true, because look, I mean, think about it, right? In my day, we did GCSEs, did A levels, went to university. Now, I had to do a clear out the other day at my parents' house, right? Chuck away a whole bunch of stuff that I hadn't used for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across all my university notes and my college notes. And I haven't looked at them for 30 odd years, right? Or thereabouts. Now, what am I going to do with it? All right. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that stuff I can't even remember, right? If I look at my notes, it might come back. I'll have to retrain in it to get back up to speed on certain things, right? But a lot of it I've forgotten, right? And you only retain the things that you keep using, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? This is big mantra in martial arts. If you don't practice, you're gonna eventually lose it, right? Mm-hmm. So you got to keep that muscle memory going. You got to keep practicing that thing that you want to be good at. So I'm not saying everyone should practice and revise and refresh themselves on all the stuff they learned forever, because that's just going to make you really ill. Mm-hmm. And you'd just be a fool, really. Why would you want to do that? You just use the things you need to use. The thing is, education, right, is about the true meaning of education is to access information that you need in a particular time and space in order to conduct the activity towards attaining a specific outcome at any moment in time. Mm-hmm. So if education is that, education is definitely not just memorizing a whole bunch of shit so you can pass some exams and then living off those laurels, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's exactly what it isn't. Life doesn't work that way. Yeah,
exactly. And right? You know what's funny about when you were sharing that is that what was coming to mind is this thing about, like, over the years, we're learning in many different ways. The people we come across, the TV media, all sorts of stuff is coming through, right? And sometimes you could come across information which seems legit or seems to work. And many years later, you find out there's an easier way to do things, or that particular thing wasn't actually correct in the way it was taught. Like, there's so many different variations on knowledge and information that can happen. And then that moment when you realize that, hang on, I could have done this way, or this could have happened, your whole perception about everything changes.
Yeah.
You realize, oh, I've been doing it wrong all this time and I could have just done it like this. There's always that kind of element as well. And it's funny because our identity and ego could also be built on top of those things.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating as well, because, whatever we've gone through is in there somewhere. And we're sitting on whatever we are now, we're sitting on top of it. Because I was thinking once about, so when I was at uni, I did a dissertation in emotional intelligence. And back then I didn't know much about it. And I learned it, I studied it and whatnot. And we do a lot of that stuff now. And one day I was thinking that, hang on a minute, that thing I did at uni is what's influenced me to be where I am right now. And I didn't even realize it at the time.
Yeah.
There's so many things like that which we go through in life, which take us to where we are right now as well. Good or bad, it happens.
Exactly. No, you're 100% right. And so let me ask you another question then. So if your egos are based on a temporary perception of you towards yourself and to others, then can that change?
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. I mean, you see it in life. You bump into somebody you knew at school. You see them many, many years later and you think, whoa, that guy's changed. Well, that guy's changed. What happened there, right? Totally different personalities, yeah. Totally different communication, connection. And you think, what happened? Isn't it? What happened? And we don't necessarily know what happened. It could have been good or bad, but things happen, and that's an indicator that, yes, anybody can change their way of life, the way they do things. Yeah. And what we've come to realize is that, there's an element of asking yourself, what Bruce used to talk about, honestly expressing yourself, like being true with yourself. This brilliant quote I read once, to paraphrase it, by Guru Nanak, that said, truth is great, but greatest still is truthful living. And I link that up with honestly expressing yourself. So to be honestly expressing yourself, that, my friend, as Bruce Lee said, is a hard thing to do. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, also in line with that as well, earlier I mentioned how the presenting problem is never the problem. So if you heal the root cause of the problem, the chain collapses, right? And now no longer those ego identities serve you. Therefore, you can discard them. Yeah. And if you can discard them, or you can work on discarding them, you are changing. Right? Now, quite often I hear people that, especially if there's a resentment or bitterness, or if they're angry with someone, right? And they're unable to forgive someone for someone that's violated someone in some way, shape, or form, is that the lack of ability to give that person a chance, to give that person forgiveness, right? And there's a sense of that person's never going to change. Point I want to make here is that people do have the ability to change. It's a choice. You have to decide, right? And that choice can completely transform your being in all of the levels: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Okay.
That reminds me of a story, not a story. It reminds me of a situation where one of my friends was saying that they wanted to do something and they couldn't do it because they said their parents won't let them do it. I just asked him a simple question. I said, how do you know that your parents won't let you do it? He said, I just know that's what they're going to do. I said, but have you asked them? He said, no. So how do you know? Right? So that thing was created that, they're going to say no. So therefore I'm not going to ask them. So but if you haven't asked, how do you know? If you haven't done it, how do you know? Like, if you've made that perception up, I think all
the listeners and viewers want to know, did he actually go and ask? And if
yes, and he actually ended up doing what he wanted to do, because they were like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, good on you.
Yeah,
because a lot of the time it's the fear of what someone might think, but not fact. Okay, it's a false perception. Right. And again, a false perception is creating false identities to match that. Okay. So you're creating an identity, an ego, right? That's based on something that's not real, something that's, a projection of your fear. I think about that for a second. We already talked about this bodybuilder example where, the whole idea of building up an ego is based on fear, right? This idea of your friend thinking that his parents are going to think a certain way and are not going to allow him to do a certain thing is built on his fears about how his parents are going to react to something, because maybe he's seen them respond to something in a certain way that was related to that area of interest that was he was akin to, and he shut it out.
And your past is not the future, right? So, if something's happened in the past for whatever scenario or situation, doesn't mean it's going to happen again. You know, it just doesn't mean that. It's not the case. It's like we say to each other, you don't know unless you ask, right? You're not going to know if somebody's going to say yes or no to something unless you actually ask it,
Absolutely.
And that classical biblical line comes to mind: ask and thou shalt receive, right? So these things have got meaning in them. They've got value and meaning in them. And we just don't do it because of our own projected fears.
Absolutely. So here's another thing I want to kind of I want to kind of come back to the koan itself. The koan being the biggest ego trip going is getting rid of your ego. So let's kind of focus on the getting rid of your ego, and how can that be an ego trip? Right.
That's an interesting one as well, and I think it's the words used there about getting rid of the ego. Is that really the end game, right? Is that the little tricky bit in there, Lax?
well, I can explain.
Yeah,
and the way I'm going to explain it is like, in order to get rid of the ego, you've assimilated this transcended state where now you're aware of the ego, right? Are you aware that this ego is temporary and it's not real? Therefore, you want to shed it. So you go into this state of, I'm bigger than this, right? I'm going to shed this. But now, being bigger than this, you've now adopted a new ego.
No, exactly. And I think to when you're asking the question about it as well is, I think it comes down to that thing about asking the right type of questions of yourself. That first element of it is getting some sort of awareness and understanding that, or self-actualization element of it, where you think, hang on, what is this? Who am I? Why? How's this formed? Where's it come from? Right. And then digging deep, because sometimes you don't want to dig deep. And sometimes I think the best way I can describe it is something's going on for you and you're not too sure. And you ask the question and you answer the question and it makes you feel light. That's most likely, what was holding it back. Like that, making the lightness will be like the truth, because you've almost shedded something, So you might not like the answer, but you've said, oh, that's why I do X, Y, and Z. And you feel like light about it. I think that's your indicator that that's where it came from, right? So then the question becomes, okay, so if that was the case, what is it that I really want to do? And where do I want to go? And then how can I go about doing that? And ask those kind of questions, as opposed to, I'm not going to ask my parents because they're going to say no.
But just to kind of extend and build on that, okay, rather than saying getting rid of your ego, I think a more powerful way to rephrase that would be to say dissolve the ego. Now imagine you take some salt, right? And and you put that salt into an ocean. That salt just dissolves into the ocean, okay? And all of a sudden is gone, right?
It just becomes part of the ocean. It just becomes a part of you.
But where is it?
Where
is it? Right? It's everywhere and nowhere all at the same time, right? Because you can't pinpoint it. At the same time, that is in the ether somewhere, is in that ocean somewhere, yeah, right? You just dissolve it, right? So what is there to gain from that?
I think it's that element of that classic thing that we talk about, empty your teacup kind of thing, where if you got your teacup and you're not drinking it and absorbing it and dissolving it within yourself, then how can you add more tea to the teacup? It's probably like, it's almost like an evolution of oneself.
100%. 100%. But fundamentally, I know what you're trying to say, but there's the other aspect, which I thought you was going to say, is the other aspect of actually you're trying to dissolve it to the point where if you've got an ego and you want to get rid of it, in order to dissolve it, you're actually trying to attain nothing.
Right? Yeah, that was my other point.
Right? That's what you're trying to say, right? I thought he was going that way, and then it kind of didn't. So I understand what you're saying as well. But really, it's not about accumulation. So empty teacup is about, it's about embodying things, but being open to learning. Right? And you can only learn things if you're receptive to it. But the ego and dissolving it towards attaining nothing is ultimately the end game. And the reason for that is because if you now embody another ego in order to get rid of an older ego or an alter ego or whatever type of egos you have sitting around, right? Active or inactive, right? You've just freaking created another ego, right? And that ego sits above the other egos because that's an enlightened ego. And then all of these are freaking unenlightened egos, right? So these egos, can push them down a bit. And actually, what you want to do is just kind of piff, paf, poof, gone.
Yeah.
Now there's nothing.
The connection my brain just made there was that, that thing we share. I think we've shared it on our other all the podcasts. Is like when we were talking about Bruce Lee when he was teaching his martial art. He didn't really have a name for it, right? And when he got interviewed, and I think in the interview he just kind of said, "Yeah, I just call it Jeet Kune Do, which means way of the intercepting fist." And he kind of had to create an ego around his martial art in a way to kind of define what it was. And then, we come to hear that when he did that, he thought, "Oh crap, I've just created another system, another style." Yeah. And to the degree where I think he actually tried to close down his clubs, right? Because he's like, "No, I didn't want to make another style or something." But what we're getting to is that when he kind of named it, he almost put ego in it. But he always talks about being formless and shapeless and not having necessarily a style in how you fight. And that's the level at which we're trying to get with our mindset and ego-lessness to be not of that stage of ego where you're fluid in processing how you go about doing things, right? If that makes sense.
100%. And actually, you've nailed a big problem in society, right? And that big problem is this, especially in the Western world, is that we need to have a label to identify and associate with a thing, right? Whether it's an idea or a material object, right? We need to have a label for it. Now, let's just say an idea, right? Bruce Lee's martial art, right, is an idea, right? It was a collection of his ideas as part of his process of developing as a martial artist during his short lifetime. So what do we have here? Ideas. How can you make a group of ideas effective and work for you so that you can tap into your ultimate potential, right? That's what martial art is ultimately, right? How can you do that? Can you understand these ideas and can you apply them not only in a combative setting, but also in a life setting, right? Whether it's in work or your personal life or wherever life takes you, Now, if you can take these ideas and apply them effectively, then you start to transcend the teachings within those ideas, right? But if you have to now start to say, actually, all these ideas belong in this freaking container, exactly, right? And we're going to call this Jeet Kune Do, right? And if it doesn't sit within that box, then it's not Jeet Kune Do. And if it doesn't sit within this box, then it's wrong, or, it's lesser than anything else, or whatever it might be. You've just created an ego. Right, you've just created an ego identity around that, and quite common and it's quite common in martial arts to be martial arts proud, right? You're proud of being a practitioner of a certain art. Now, I always said to my students, and this is pretty much Bruce's outlook on things. You got 2 arms, 2 legs. How many different ways can you use them? Right. And, Bruce did quote to this as well. He said, unless you got 3 arms and 4 legs, then you can create a different style, right? So what is martial art, right? To avoid you becoming martial arts proud, it's just a way of using your body effectively in a bunch of different applications where someone might be moving in predefined ways and you training to respond to that intelligently to defend, counterattack, and attack your opponent. That is it. Right? To protect yourself or loved one when put in harm's way, right? Isn't that it? Unless you're in competition, in which case you're doing it for, competition gains and that kind of thing. But ultimately, that's what it's about. So Bruce had to give it a name because when he was being interviewed, the interviewers were pressuring him, what is it? So he gave it a name. And then he regretted it. But there was a period, right, before he regretted it, where there's a story where him and one of his closest confidantes and one of his 3 certified instructors, Dan and Santo, were in a car. And the story goes that, when they saw someone with some swag, they're like, he's got Jeet Kune Do, she's got Jeet Kune Do, and things like that. So they used Jeet Kune Do as a way to reference excellence or brilliance or beauty or glamour or whatever it was. It was like the best of the best, right? To bring out that specialness in things, right? So if something had that specialness, something had a wow factor, like, oh, that's got Jeet Kune Do, right? Because the essence of Jeet Kune Do is excellence, right? It's cultivating excellence. But isn't that the whole idea behind judo, aikido, karate, everything else? Of course it is. It's about you untapping into your ultimate potential. The sign, the yin yang sign that you normally see, the Tahiti, that means ultimate potential. I was literally teaching this to my class yesterday, and it's about tapping into your ultimate potential. So you have to be careful, right? When you label something, right? But without getting trapped and indoctrinated by it, right? So use the label, right? So people can associate with something because they need to be able to associate something so they can apply meaning to it. Because as Alfred Korzybski said, we are meaning making machines, Our common mutual friend, Suki, he always talks about Alfred Korzybski and his amazing teachings. And that's the biggest teaching, one of the biggest key teachings that came up as a consequence of that. We are meaning making machines. We have to find a way to make meaning out of something. Otherwise, we don't function effectively because we can't put some meaning inside our minds. Therefore, we can't kind of comprehend things.
Exactly.
So we kind of we become disorientated, right? So
the kind of dilemma, or even the genius of it, in the sense that it is and it isn't, right? And it's that fine line that because of this material body, we the brain works with association to get an idea of what something. So if I said TV, for example, you get it. It's like rectangle. It could be square. You get an idea of what a TV is and what it represents. But there's not one TV. There's many different TVs, and they work and function in different ways. But if you just thought that this is the only TV and you get caught up in that ego, then you're not going to understand everything else that's around it. Right. And that's what we're talking about here. So even though we talk about Bruce Lee, we're not trying to get trapped in the ego of Bruce Lee. And the idea and identity of it is way beyond that. But it's to give you an association to say it's like this. It's like metaphorical and similes.
But using the idea of a TV, right? What's the point of a TV, right? Now, you can get caught up in, all right, I've got a Samsung, you've got a Panasonic, you've got a freaking Hitachi, whatever it is, right? My TV's better than your TV, right? My TV's better than your TV, bullshit, But isn't the point of a fucking TV about the messages that the programs that you're watching to receive them? Exactly. So if you like documentaries, wildlife documentaries, watch wildlife documentaries and connect with Mother Earth and nature and so on, right? If you like murder mystery, suspense and freaking cop shows and things like that, then watch that, because you'll learn about those things or you'll get entertained by those things. That's the message. That's the experience, right? And ultimately, it's about gaining that experience and gaining the understanding in that. It's not about the freaking box, right? And at the same time, that box is a metaphor for the label, right? Or the whatever we start to create the identity or the ego around. We have to be careful that we don't miss the point. Keep your eye on the ball, right? And make sure that, you use that mechanism to become better, to become more conscious, right? To elevate your consciousness, right? Rather than get trapped with that label, that ego identity, that persona that comes with that, and so on. Because some point down the line, it won't serve you. It won't serve you. In fact, it may even be worse. It'll do a disservice to you. Okay, so something to be mindful of, right? Something
that thing we say when we say that you can't see the frame if you're in the picture. All right. Do you know what I mean? You can't see the frame if you're in the picture. You have to kind of become the observer to see how big the frame is, or how big your ego is, or how small it is, or what that parameter actually is, to then be able to go, hang on, there's more to this. I'm not just this frame, and I'm not stuck inside the picture. So
if you got a small frame, you got a small ego, and if you got a massive fuck-off frame, you got a big ego.
And then
that's a beautiful analogy.
What happens when you got no frame?
Frameless. Let's go frameless, people. That's the whole point.
That's
this
it.
whole thing is about being frameless.
Awesome.
So, on that point, I think is a good point, good place to actually read the koan out. Okay, unless you got something else that comes.
No, that's it. That's cool. Yeah.
So, as a reminder, this koan is the biggest ego trip going is getting rid of your ego. Now, this koan is directly based on a quote by Alan Watts. Okay, now Alan Watts famously said this, and he went on to say, the biggest ego trip going is getting rid of your ego. So ego is an attachment for the desire for pleasurable sensory experiences with our material bodies and sensory faculties so that we feel good and happy. When we do not feel good and happy, we suffer. Buddha said desire is the cause of all suffering. To get rid of our suffering, then, we must learn to get rid of our ego. But quite often, in the process of getting rid of our ego, we start to desire to feel good and happy by letting it go, which is just another ego attachment. To get rid of your ego, do it for nothing, to attain no thing. All right? Okay, so there you go.
Just let everyone think on that one for a moment, or feel on that one for a moment. That's amazing, man. I think the biggest takeaway that I've got from this is be frameless, right?
That's the wisdom bomb for the
That's the wisdom bomb,
right? Wisdom bomb for the day, right? Be frameless, my friend.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Sifu, that's been another amazing, episode on the art of thinking without thinking. And we like having fun with this. We just see where we go. We're not trying to say we're right or wrong in any way. We're just sharing ideas and trying to stretch the mind as to what's possible for us. And any last words, Sifu, before we close off this episode?
Just be frameless, my friend. I'm frameless.
I like that one. That's a good one. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing everything, Sifu. And, as always, everyone, either get a copy of the book. You could get it from Amazon or just go to martialmindpower.com. Any questions, put them in the comments, get in touch with us. We're happy to have conversations and even talk about topics that might come up for you. And so on that note, signing out from Jatinder and Sifu Lak. And then until next time, take care, everybody.
See you soon.